In a tense Senate hearing on police brutality, Jasmine Crockett confronted Ted Cruz, not just about racism in law enforcement, but about a deeper rot in the system. When Cruz dismissed the victims as isolated incidents, Jasmine revealed a secret document showing his office helped delay investigations into migrant abuse. The fallout rocked Congress and split the nation. But one moment cut through it all, when Jasmine leaned forward and said something that stopped even her critics cold. What did she say that changed everything? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air outside the Rayburn House office building was thick with tension, like the silence before a thunderstorm. Cameras flashed, security details moved with precision, and reporters whispered predictions that no one dared say aloud. Inside, the hearing room was packed beyond capacity. The sign on the wall read, House Oversight Committee, Emergency Session on Civil Rights and Law Enforcement. But those words were just a formality. Everyone knew what this was. America was about to watch a war, not with fists or bullets, but with testimonies and truths sharper than any blade. At the center of this reckoning was a name already trending nationwide, Jasmine Crockett. And across the aisle, sharpening his voice like a dagger, sat Senator Ted Cruz, flanked by allies determined to defend the very system under scrutiny. The doors shut behind them with a hollow echo. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a battlefield. Jasmine Crockett entered without flinching, dressed in black, her expression steel-wrought. She walked past senators who had called her radical, past aides who tried not to meet her eyes, and sat at the witness table like it was her rightful throne. For her, this wasn't theater, it was personal. She had stood on protest lines where tear gas clouded the air and rubber bullets screamed through crowds. She had held mothers sobbing for sons who never made it home. And today she was their voice. The moment her name was called, a hush fell over the room like gravity had shifted. The chairman nodded. Cameras zoomed in. And then a voice cut through. I just want to make one thing clear, Ted Cruz said, his voice calm but coiled like a snake. This hearing, despite its lofty title, is nothing more than a politically charged stunt designed to smear the brave men and women in uniform. The words hung in the air, smug and deliberate. Some Republican members nodded in sync. Let's not pretend, Cruz continued, that law and order is the enemy. It was the opening shot in what would become one of the most explosive hearings in recent congressional history. But before Jasmine could speak, before the storm building in her chest could be unleashed, the committee chair raised a hand. The room, already taut with grief, fell into a deeper silence. They were about to hear from someone whose sorrow cut deeper than any political statement ever could. The mother stepped forward like a ghost wrapped in skin. Her name was Latasha Rowe, and in her trembling hands she clutched a photograph of her son, Micah, 17, unarmed, a straight A student, now reduced to another name in America's long, bloody obituary of black youth. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. But every word that left her mouth cracked the air like a hammer against glass. He was just walking, she said, staring straight into the cameras like she was daring the nation to look away, holding a sign that said, "Don't shoot," and they shot him anyway. Her voice faltered, not from weakness, but from the weight of something no mother should ever have to carry. Behind her, Jasmine Crockett gripped the armrest so hard her knuckles turned white. On the opposite end of the dais, Senator Ted Cruz looked away, fiddling with a pen, as if bureaucracy could somehow erase brutality. The hearing room, which had moments ago buzzed with political maneuvering, now pulsed with something raw and undeniable. Truth. Latasha reached into her bag and pulled out a clear plastic evidence sleeve. Inside was Micah's blood-stained hoodie. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. She held it up, and the silence that followed was louder than any siren. This, she whispered, is all I got back. No badge number, no arrest. Just this. Jasmine's breath caught, not from shock, but from recognition. She had seen this before. Too many times. Too many mothers with the same hollow eyes, the same fury swimming just beneath grief. One of the aides behind Cruz tried to slip him a memo, but he waved it off. Even he knew, at least for that moment, that politics had lost. that no prepared statement could compete with the image of a grieving black mother holding the last item her son had ever worn. Then Latasha turned to Jasmine. Her eyes, glassy but blazing, found the congresswoman across the room. "Please," she said, her voice quivering but unyielding, "don't let them bury my boy twice." Jasmine nodded slowly. No speeches, no grandstanding, just a promise made in silence. Because this wasn't just testimony, it was a battle cry wrapped in mourning. And as Latasha was helped from the stand, her words didn't leave with her. They remained thick as smoke, daring the next person who spoke to pretend that justice had already been served. The weight of that hoodie, of that grief, had not even left the air when Jasmine Crockett rose from her chair. She walked quietly to Latasha's side and did the one thing politics had forgotten how to do. She reached out and took her hand. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. That gesture alone said what 1,000 editorials never could. "I see you. I hear you. I will not let this vanish into paperwork." Latasha trembled, as if the memory of her son's final breath had wrapped around her spine, and Jasmine became her anchor in a room designed to drift past pain. Behind them, someone stifled a sob. A Capitol staffer wiped her cheek. But Ted Cruz didn't move. He sat back in his leather chair like a man reviewing tax policy, not listening to a mother describe the death of her son. His eyes stayed on the folder before him. Its bold title, "Unauthorized Demonstration Activity, Southeast Sector." To him, this wasn't about justice. It was about optics, about framing, about controlling the narrative before anyone realized what was really at stake. And then, with all the solemnity of a man defending a system he believed belonged to him, he spoke. "Mrs. Rowe," Cruz began, his tone dry, clipped and eerily detached. "Your son was present during a protest that, according to our records, had not received a formal permit." Gas rippled through the room, sharper this time, edged with disbelief. Jasmine's head snapped toward him. Latasha froze, as if someone had asked whether her grief had been filed correctly. But Cruz wasn't finished. "I'm simply asking," he continued, unshaken, "was your son lawfully assembled? Or was he participating in a potentially volatile, unauthorized action?" Jasmine's grip on Latasha's hand tightened. Hard. The mother's lips parted, but no words came out. Only silence. Only the brutal realization that the man who had never met her son was now trying to put him on trial. In death. That was the moment something broke loose in the room. Not just hearts, but illusions. The hearing wasn't about Micah anymore. It had become a fight over who got to define justice. Who had the power to decide whether a black child's last moments were heroic or criminal? Whether his life was mourned or footnoted? Jasmine slowly straightened in her seat, her spine drawing a clean, defiant line through the chamber. Because if Ted Cruz was going to play judge and jury over another black child's corpse, then he had just made the gravest mistake of his political life. He had invited Jasmine Crockett to answer. For a moment, the chamber was suspended in that unbearable stillness, the kind that follows tragedy but precedes confrontation. And Jasmine Crockett, sitting with fire trapped behind her ribs, knew the time for silence had passed. Grief had spoken. Now justice would answer. She stood slowly, not abruptly, not like a politician making a point, but like a woman rising from centuries of weight. Her chair scraped gently against the floor, but it sounded louder than Cruz's voice had minutes earlier. She didn't wait to be called on. She didn't need permission. She belonged here just as much as any senator with a nameplate and a staff. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor as she stepped forward, but her presence roared. The room shifted, not in noise, but in gravity. All eyes turned, and not a single camera dared blink. "Let me say this," Jasmine began, her voice calm but firm, her eyes locked directly on Ted Cruz. "The law isn't meant to scare people. It's not here to humiliate grieving mothers. It's not supposed to punish people who speak up." She paused, her voice tightening with resolve. "Law isn't a tool to crush people. It's supposed to protect them." The sentence landed like a stone dropped in still water. Then she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small, well-worn copy of the U.S. Constitution, flagged and folded from years of use. "I carry this because I believe in it, Because people fought for me to even be in this room, much less hold this book. Her tone deepened. We're sitting here asking whether a child deserved to die because someone didn't fill out a permit? That's not justice. That's cruelty hiding behind red tape. She flipped the booklet open and held it up. The First Amendment says this: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. She looked around the room, making sure every senator, every aide, every camera caught what came next. It doesn't say people need a permission slip to speak out. It doesn't say they need to be quiet about pain. It says peaceably to assemble. That's the promise. That's the right. And it was broken the night Micah was killed. The chamber held its breath. Jasmine didn't rush. She let the silence do its own work. When you twist the law to shame a mother like Mrs. Rowe, you're not defending law and order. You're using the law to hurt the very people it's supposed to help. Ted Cruz leaned forward at last, his expression tight, his tone measured like a man reaching for the high ground. The law, he said coldly, still needs order. Feelings don't write policy. We're here to protect the system, not to burn it down over tragedy. He looked toward the cameras, then back at her. You're emotional, Congresswoman, but this is a courtroom, not a protest. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink, because Ted Cruz still didn't understand. To him, the system was something to protect. To her, it was something that had failed over and over again. And she hadn't come here to mourn it. She had come to make it answer. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Not yet. Because this wasn't just theory to her. It wasn't academic or rhetorical or political. Beneath every word she spoke was a scar. And beneath every scar, a story. One she had never planned to tell in this room. But now, she had to. Her eyes scanned the rows of senators, the polished wood of the chamber, the marble walls that seemed to close in like the corners of a courtroom. Then her gaze returned to the microphone. Her voice lowered, not with hesitation but with intent. She wasn't performing. She was remembering. Let me tell you a story, she said. One that never made the news. One that almost never made it out of the dark. The room leaned in. Years ago, I was a public defender in Dallas, fresh out of law school, idealistic, hopeful. I believed in the system back then. God help me, I really did. She exhaled slowly. Her eyes weren't glossy. They were sharp, like glass forged under fire. It was late, maybe 10 p.m. I had gotten a call about one of my clients. Young black man, first-time offender, nothing violent. He called me in a panic because the police were at his door, banging, trying to get in. He said they didn't have a warrant. He said he didn't know what to do. And I told him, don't open the door, I'm coming. Jasmine paused, letting the room feel the clock ticking backward. 15 minutes later, I pulled up to that apartment complex. I wore a black pantsuit. I had my legal badge, my briefcase. I wasn't there to yell or argue. I was there to do my job. She straightened, but her voice grew quieter, forcing the room to listen even harder. I walked up to the officers, calm, polite. I introduced myself. I said, "Good evening. I'm the attorney for the tenant. Can I please see the warrant?" That's all. That was my whole offense. Asking for a piece of paper. A pause, not dramatic, necessary. The first officer didn't answer. He just looked at me. Then slowly, without a word, he unholstered his weapon and raised it, right at my face. The room stilled. You could feel it, like all the air had been sucked out. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I didn't want to give him any excuse. I just stood there with my hands visible and said again, "I'm just asking to see the warrant." But to him, that wasn't a legal request. It was a threat. Not because I was loud, not because I was armed, but because I was a black woman who knew her rights and dared to say them out loud. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from fury buried too long. He never showed me that warrant. They left. Maybe because I stood firm, maybe because someone inside called for backup. I'll never know, but I do know this. I went back to my car, locked the doors, and I cried. Because I realized something that night. I could know the law inside and out. I could wear the suit and carry the briefcase and still be one wrong move away from being a headline. She looked up, not blinking. So when I say the law isn't always a shield for people like me, it's because I've felt it pressed against my skin like a loaded gun. No sound, no rustle. Even Cruz, even the aides behind him, they couldn't look away. And I still came back the next day. I still showed up in court. I still defended people like my client. Not because the system is perfect, but because someone has to stand in the gap when it fails. She let the silence stretch. Not because she had nothing left to say, but because she wanted them to sit with it. Really sit with it. So don't talk to me about order or permits or the way things are supposed to work on paper. Because on paper, I was safe that night. But in reality, I was one breath away from a chalk outline. Jasmine's story didn't need applause. It settled over the room like a verdict. But as the silence grew too heavy for pride to bear, Ted Cruz leaned in, unwilling to let truth speak without trying to tame it. Jasmine turned her head toward him, eyes unwavering. Her voice was lower now, but laced with something even sharper than rage. Certainty. "Of course you trust the system, Senator," she said, the words slicing through the quiet. "You can afford to. You've never had to fear it. You've never had to explain your existence to a badge. You've never had to hold your breath when red and blue lights flash behind you. You don't flinch when law knocks at your door, because it doesn't come for you." Her jaw tightened. Her voice didn't rise, but her words grew heavier, more deliberate. "You believe in the law because it was built for you. I believe in the law because I have to, but I've also had to survive it. You get to argue theory. I've lived the trauma." Then she delivered the line that split the room in two. "You can believe in the law, Senator, because it has never pinned you to the ground." A hush fell, electric and thick. Even the cameraman hesitated to blink. For one breathless second, it felt like something had cracked open, not just in the chamber, but in the myth of fairness itself. Ted Cruz straightened, his expression tightening into the familiar armor of a man who'd lost the room but refused to lose the frame. He didn't yell. He didn't falter. He spoke with the icy polish of a seasoned performer whose mask had been dented but not broken. "And that," he replied coolly, "is exactly the kind of mindset that's tearing this country apart." He folded his hands, pretending they weren't shaking. "Painting our legal system as your enemy doesn't make it better. It just feeds the division. You want justice, Congresswoman? Start by respecting the very structure that makes justice possible." There it was, the pivot, the dismissal, a return to order as a shield against accountability. But Jasmine didn't flinch, because she'd heard that kind of deflection her whole life, and she had come here to bury it. Cruz's response had been as smooth as polished marble, but it rang hollow against the weight of lived experience. Jasmine didn't reply right away. She didn't need to, because what she had next wasn't a retort. It was proof. She moved with calm precision, but something in the room shifted the moment her hands reached below the table. No one spoke, but everyone leaned forward. Staffers, senators, even the security by the door. Jasmine opened her briefcase slowly, as if reaching for something fragile. Inside wasn't a binder or a notepad, but a thick, weathered manila folder. It was creased at the corners, marked confidential in faded red ink. She ran her fingers over the edge like someone handling evidence in a trial, not for show, but for truth. Then she stood, not like a politician seeking the spotlight, but like a witness stepping into history. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I wasn't planning to share this today," she said quietly, her tone controlled but caring, like a slow-building wave. "But I've sat here and listened long enough to lectures about order, about division, about how we're the ones making this country worse by daring to name what hurts us." She held the folder high enough for every camera to catch a glimpse of the red stamp. The room tensed. This folder contains an internal whistleblower report from the Department of Homeland Security. It was never released publicly. It wasn't meant to be. But I have it, because someone inside couldn't live with what they saw. Gasps began to rise in the room. Cruz narrowed his eyes but didn't speak. "It outlines, very clearly, documented cases of physical abuse, racial profiling, and illegal detainment by agents working along the southern border. These aren't rumors. They're sworn statements, photographs, medical reports. In one case, a teenage boy from Guatemala was held for 12 days in a concrete cell without food for the first two. Another woman, a mother, was separated from her 5-year-old daughter and told she had no rights in this country. The chamber fell absolutely still. Jasmine flipped the folder open and pulled out a printed report, 8 pages thick, the paper slightly curled, corners marked in yellow highlighter and red ink. "But that's not the part that shocked me," she said, stepping toward the dais. "What shocked me was what came next." She turned to the second page, held it out so the cameras could focus. Her voice sharpened. "Here," she said, pointing to a redacted paragraph, "is a line indicating that a formal internal investigation had been launched until it was abruptly shut down." She paused just long enough for the silence to grow uneasy. "Why?" "Because according to this report, quote, Advisory Council from Senator Cruz's office recommends delay due to political optics in upcoming media cycle." Her gaze hardened. "Let me be even more specific, since some people in this room still like to pretend everything's theoretical. The abuse in this report wasn't vague. It wasn't hidden. It names units within Customs and Border Protection operating in Texas and Arizona. It names detainees, mostly migrants of Latin origin, who were shoved, insulted, and in at least 2 cases, hospitalized. And it names your office, Senator Cruz, as the one that blocked the formal inquiry from moving forward." There was an audible intake of breath, the kind of sound people make when they don't know whether to speak or throw up. Behind her, a few aides whispered frantically. One reached for their phone. But Jasmine's eyes never left Cruz. "Your office," she said again, slower this time, "chose to protect optics, not people. You knew there was a pattern of violence against Latino immigrants, and you let it die in the dark." And then, without hesitation, she crossed the final few steps and laid the printed document flat on the polished desk in front of him. Right in front of the cameras, right in front of the country. "You talk about law like it's sacred," she said, "but laws don't mean anything if the people in power get to choose when to look the other way. The law you defend chose a side, and the victims were never the ones who looked like you." The blow landed not with volume, but with gravity. Cruz sat motionless, his mouth tight, his hands frozen above the paper. Not a word, not a breath. The kind of silence that can't be spun. Every camera in the room trained in like snipers, one on Jasmine's unshaking face, one on Cruz's paling expression, and one on the folder between them. You could hear the mechanical whir of zoom lenses adjusting, trying to capture every flicker, every flinch, every exposed nerve. No one dared interrupt. Even the chairman, who had tapped his gavel several times earlier, sat still now, his eyes wide. Because Jasmine Crockett had done what no rebuttal could erase. She hadn't made a point. She had revealed a pattern and named its protector. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't feel like Capitol Hill. It felt like a reckoning years overdue. The folder still lay on Cruz's desk, glowing under the overhead lights like a loaded weapon no one dared touch. And though the room had settled into silence, the weight hadn't lifted. Not from the chamber, not from the man it accused. That's when Cruz leaned forward, slow and practiced, like a man stepping over broken glass. More worried about perception than truth. But Jasmine Crockett was already watching, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. She knew the game wasn't over. Not yet. Senator Cruz cleared his throat, breaking the silence like a man trying to reclaim control of a room that had already slipped away from him. His voice came measured, clipped, like every syllable had been rehearsed for a soundbite. "Congresswoman," he began, "we both know the legal system isn't perfect. No human institution is. But tearing it down because of a few tragic mistakes I don't deny, isn't the solution." He adjusted his posture, straightened his cuffs. Posture politics. "We live in a country where due process exists," he continued, "where cases are tried, reviewed, and sometimes overturned. That's what separates us from chaos. The fact that we can recognize mistakes and correct them means the system works, however slowly." A few senators behind him nodded, subtly, the kind of gesture that didn't say agreement, just survival. "But when we take these isolated incidents and use them to paint the entire structure as corrupt, Cruz shook his head with mock sadness. That's not reform. That's destruction. And that's the mindset that's dividing this nation. This impulse to reduce everything to a weapon, to assume bad faith, to reject the very institutions that have upheld this democracy. He let the sentence linger, like a closing argument before a jury. If the system were truly broken, he added, you wouldn't be sitting here today. For a brief moment, the chamber was still. Cruz leaned back, his hands folded smugly. He thought he had landed the final word, but Jasmine Crockett had been waiting, and now she moved. She stood slowly, this time not to present a document or deliver an accusation, but to speak a truth that came not from paper, but from history. Senator, she said quietly but firmly, you just made a point I've heard my whole life, that the system can't be that bad if someone like me made it this far. She took a breath and stepped forward. But let me tell you what you don't see. You don't see the nights I spent trying to get innocent clients released from jail after being misidentified. You don't see the mothers who begged me to believe their sons weren't armed, weren't guilty, weren't even there. And they were right. She reached into a second folder. This one thinner, neater, not redacted, just a list. These are the names of 28 individuals wrongfully convicted in the past 18 months, she said. 28 lives derailed. 28 stories erased until someone decided to look closer. She held the list in one hand, letting the pages sway slightly from the air vent above the dais. And out of those 28, she continued, locking eyes with Cruz, 23 are Black or Latino. Some served months, others served years. One man, Randall Epps, served 14 years for a crime that didn't even occur in his county. Her voice grew stronger, bolder, more surgical. You call that a mistake. I call that a structure that knows exactly where the weight should fall. She stepped forward again, closer to the mic. One woman on this list, Maria Delgado, was arrested in a traffic stop and held for 7 weeks without charges because her name sounded familiar to someone in a database. You think that's an exception? That's a pattern with a badge. Gasps murmured from the back rows. A few aides looked down. The cameras kept rolling. You say the system works because sometimes it corrects itself, she asked. Do you know what it costs a person to survive long enough to be corrected? You think justice delayed is still justice. But when you're the one waiting, when you're the one inside, every day is a sentence. She held up the list. This is not collateral damage. It is not coincidence. This is design. And then came the line, measured, perfect, devastating. You call these isolated cases, she said, her voice cutting clean through the air. I call it a mechanism, one built to fail certain people quietly and consistently. No one moved. You say the system isn't perfect. I agree. But I also say it's not neutral. It never has been. It was built by men who wrote one thing on paper and practiced another in law. And now we're living in the shadows of that design. She lowered the paper and let her hands rest on the table. Senator Cruz, you can afford to call this imperfection because it hasn't knocked on your door at midnight. It hasn't taken your brother or your father or made you fear for your child's life every time they leave the house. Her eyes didn't waver. But for the rest of us, what you call errors feel like outcomes. The silence was absolute. She turned toward the panel, speaking now not just to Cruz, but to the entire room. We are not asking for perfection. We're asking for accountability, for a system that stops pretending its sins are isolated, for leaders who stop defending the status quo like it's some sacred artifact. One of the reporters scribbled furiously. Another just watched, stunned. You can't reform what you refuse to admit is broken. Cruz didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of her words wasn't something rebuttal could lift. And somewhere in that stillness, the tide shifted again. This wasn't just Jasmine defending herself anymore. She had become the voice of everyone who had been told they were a statistical error. And she had just made sure the whole country was listening. The hearing was over, but its fallout had only just begun. The words had left Jasmine's mouth like sparks, and now they were setting the nation ablaze. Within 30 minutes of the gavel striking, the internet split like a fault line under pressure. Trending across every platform from X to Instagram were 2 hashtags, YE Stand with Cruz and Passion Crockett Crushes. Cruz, dueling for dominance like flags planted on opposite ends of a battlefield. Clips of the hearing flooded timelines, Jasmine slamming the confidential report on Cruz's desk, Cruz staring stone-faced as she called the system designed. One video, slowed down and set to dramatic music, showed her saying, "You call this a mistake, I call it design," and had already racked up over 4 million views in under 2 hours. Supporters of Cruz called her performance an unhinged display of resentment, but her defenders saw something else, a reckoning decades overdue. "She didn't destroy Cruz," one tweet read, "she revealed him." In every comment thread, strangers fought like family at Thanksgiving. One side clung to tradition, the other demanded a revolution. Over on cable news, the storm gathered faster than a hurricane on warm waters. Fox News launched its counterstrike before sunset. Host after host took their place like soldiers in formation. On the Ingram angle, Jasmine was described as the left's newest weapon of racial division. The chyron beneath her image read, "Crockett, fury, not facts." Sean Hannity played the clip where Jasmine listed 23 wrongfully convicted people of color, then cut away saying, "See? This isn't about justice. This is about vengeance." A guest from a conservative think tank chimed in, calling her a chaos agent, trained in identity politics, more interested in headlines than healing. But perhaps the most inflammatory came from Tucker Carlson's podcast that evening. Jasmine Crockett wants to burn the Constitution and rebuild it in her own image. And if you think I'm exaggerating, watch the tape. Her name became a target. Her tone, her face, her earrings, even the way she said Mr. Cruz, all dissected for sport. But across the dial, CNN was building its own artillery. Anderson Cooper opened with a slow replay of Jasmine's speech, letting it run uninterrupted. When it ended, the panel sat in silence for a beat. Then former federal judge Letitia Grant spoke. That was not rage. That was legal brilliance. That was pain sharpened into precision. Don Lemon, appearing unexpectedly, shook his head in disbelief. She said what Black America has whispered in kitchen tables for years, out loud in front of power, with cameras rolling. The network ran a headline banner that read, "The voice the system tried to bury." Opinion pieces exploded across the media ecosystem. The New York Times called Jasmine the future face of legal resistance. The Washington Post called her testimony a tectonic shift in congressional hearing culture. But the Wall Street Journal accused her of weaponizing emotion to blur the lines between anecdote and evidence. She was a Rorschach test for America's conscience. To some, a hero, to others, a threat. Back on social media, the war took stranger forms. A TikTok creator recreated the hearing with puppets. A parody account named Cruise Control was created and suspended within hours. Memes flooded Reddit. One showed Jasmine in gladiator armor, standing over Cruz with the words, "This is justice." In a popular podcast on Apple's Top 10, two Gen Z hosts broke down the hearing minute by minute, calling it the courtroom version of dropping the mic on injustice. Meanwhile, conservative influencers called her unhinged, emotional, and unprofessional. But the harder they tried to paint her as out of line, the more people tuned in to see the truth for themselves. Jasmine herself said nothing. No tweets, no interviews, no hashtags. She stayed quiet, letting the silence do what sound bites never could, make people wonder what she'd say next. But the silence wasn't empty. It was strategic. It was power, and it let the rest of the country speak in her place. In classrooms, in kitchens, in barbershops, in boardrooms, her words were repeated, not just the dramatic ones, not just design, but quieter lines too. The law doesn't fail everyone equally. Justice delayed isn't justice. It's survival taxed. You trust the law because it's never been used to pin you to the ground. Somewhere in Houston, a civics teacher changed her entire week's lesson plan. Somewhere in Montana, a father rewound the hearing footage and watched it with his son. And somewhere in Washington, aides were already drafting talking points, knowing full well the midterms just got a lot more complicated. The hearing had ended, but the air hadn't cleared. If anything, the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's testimony was heavier than the noise. And in that silence, something darker rose. Not applause, not outrage, but a phone call no one expected. The call came in the dead of night, 2:14 a.m. Her apartment was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the flicker of a street lamp outside. Jasmine had fallen asleep on her couch, fully dressed, still clutching the printed report that had shaken the Capitol just hours earlier. Her phone buzzed, screen glowing in the darkness, with an unknown number. El Paso area code. She let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then she picked up. "Hello." The voice on the other end didn't sound like a journalist, or a staffer, or anyone looking for a soundbite. It sounded like someone who'd been carrying a secret for too long and couldn't anymore. "Congresswoman Crockett," the voice rasped. "This is her. You don't know me. I was a Border Patrol officer, retired. I need to tell you something." Jasmine sat upright, heart suddenly alert. Her fingers tightened around the phone. "What is this about?" "It's about what you said at the hearing." The man, who only gave his name as Jim, continued. "About systems that pretend to be broken when they're actually working just as designed." There was a pause. "I served under the policy." Jasmine didn't speak, didn't interrupt. She just listened. And what she heard made the hairs on her neck rise. Jim detailed an unwritten code followed by Border Patrol officers in remote southern sectors, especially along Texas's borderlands. It wasn't official, and it was never discussed on paper, but everyone knew it existed. A verbal directive, a whispered instruction. If the person didn't have papers, Jim said, we weren't expected to follow procedure. Force was fine. Detainment was flexible. There was even a phrase for it. They called it the discretion buffer. Jasmine frowned. "That sounds like a loophole." "It was a hammer," Jim replied. "The calls for accountability were growing louder by the day," he said. "And someone, somewhere, needed to know how bad it had gotten, how far it reached, how long it had been ignored." "It started out subtle," Jim said. "Then came a shift about 18 months ago. After a few meetings with DHS regional attorneys, things changed. Orders came down more aggressively. Word got around that Senator Cruz's office had concerns about optics if certain reports got out. Suddenly, investigations disappeared. Complaints were unfounded before they were read." He hesitated, then added, "And if you brought it up, you were reassigned or retired early." That last part was why Jim was speaking now. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she tapped the screen and opened her phone's recording app. She started recording without saying a word. Jim kept talking. Told her about a 16-year-old Honduran boy shoved face first into concrete after asking for water. About a woman who miscarried in a holding facility and was told her citizenship didn't include sympathy. About a memo, verbally delivered, that instructed officers to limit documentation of use of force if it involved non-status individuals. "And nobody stopped it?" Jasmine asked. "No one even tried," he said. Then came the final blow. "You want to know how we knew it was backed by DC?" he said. "Because whenever things got messy, we were told not to escalate, not for moral reasons, but because someone from Cruz's office would be calling for a status update." Silence. Then, "They weren't managing immigration. They were managing headlines." Jasmine closed her eyes. She thought about the hoodie Latasha Rowe had held up in the courtroom. She thought about the ICE protest signs, the parents, the missing children. And now this, a voice in the dark, telling her what she already suspected. The cruelty wasn't random, it was institutional. After Jim hung up, Jasmine sat alone in her kitchen, lit only by the dim light over the stove. The recording sat in her phone like a bomb. Her mind raced. If she released it, she wouldn't just be exposing a bad policy. She'd be exposing an active cover-up, one that could implicate DHS, ICE, CBP, and a sitting senator. There would be chaos, calls for resignations, investigations, congressional fallout. But what scared her more than the storm was the silence that would follow if she said nothing. She thought about what Jim said, that he called her because he saw her stand up when no one else would. He had risked his pension, his name, his life, and now she had to decide whether to do the same. For 3 hours she sat in silence. Then she got up, went to her office, pulled out a legal pad, and began drafting what would become the most dangerous speech of her career. At 5:07 a.m., Jasmine called her chief of staff. "I need you to do something," she said. "Anything. Get me a primetime interview. CNN, MSNBC, even PBS. I don't care. We do it tonight." "What's going on?" "We're done waiting for justice to come from inside the system. This time we're bringing the evidence to the people." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. By 6:45 a.m., the media requests had begun pouring in. By 8:15, Jasmine's office announced she would be appearing that evening on national television with evidence that would demand a federal investigation into the policies of our immigration system and the people who built it. The response was immediate. Fox News called it a smear campaign in progress. Tomi Lahren tweeted, "Brace yourselves, another performance incoming. Crockett can't win in court, so she's running to TV." But others watched in silence. Activists, journalists, legal watchdogs. They knew the difference between performance and proof. And if Jasmine Crockett was stepping into the lights with a recording, something was about to break. The nation had held its breath since sunrise, waiting to see if Jasmine Crockett would follow through on her word. By nightfall, the stakes had shifted from the chamber floor to the nation's living rooms, and Jasmine wasn't coming alone. She had brought the truth, and Cruz was about to run out of places to hide. The lights in the CNN studio were cold and clinical, but the tension in the air was electric. The program was billed as a special bipartisan dialogue on the future of justice in the American border. But everyone tuning in, every living room, every college dorm, every bar TV flickering above the hum of conversation, knew the real reason they were watching. Jasmine Crockett and Senator Ted Cruz, live unfiltered on the same stage, a reckoning in real time. The camera panned across the studio as Anderson Cooper opened the segment with measured calm. His eyes betrayed it, though. This wasn't just another roundtable. This was political dynamite. "Tonight," Cooper began, "we're joined by Representative Jasmine Crockett and Senator Ted Cruz. We'll be discussing recent allegations involving undocumented migrants and federal enforcement policy. But first, Congresswoman Crockett, I understand you brought something new to this conversation?" Jasmine didn't look to Cruz. She didn't need to. She looked straight into the lens, into America. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, clipped like a lawyer reading into evidence. "I've brought a piece of audio, a phone call, recorded 2 nights ago, from a former Border Patrol officer." Cooper's brow rose. Cruz's chin lifted. The room contracted. "It details an unofficial policy," Jasmine continued, "enforced along the southern border, a policy that encouraged violence against undocumented individuals, and more critically, it names your office, Senator Cruz, as advising DHS officials to delay investigations for political optics." A gasp rippled through the audience. Cruz's jaw twitched. "You're playing games," he muttered, but she was already reaching for the tablet on the table. She tapped play. The audio filled the studio. "We called it the discretion buffer. If the victim had no papers, it didn't matter. Nobody cared. Senator Cruz's office, yeah, they didn't write it down, but we were told make it disappear." You could hear a pin drop. The voice crackled, real, unequivocal, tired, a man confessing to something that had lived too long in the dark. They weren't managing immigration, they were managing headlines. When it ended, the silence was deafening. Jasmine leaned forward, voice calm as fire. "You can say it's fake, you can deny it, but every person watching tonight knows what they just heard." Cruz shifted in his seat. His face had gone pale, but his training kicked in like reflex. "That's hearsay," he snapped. "One anonymous voice on a recording doesn't prove anything. This is irresponsible, borderline slanderous." "And yet," Jasmine interrupted, "you still haven't denied it." His mouth opened, then closed. The studio froze. Even Cooper didn't speak. "Senator," Jasmine said, leaning closer, "you can say a lot of things, but tonight you can't lie your way past a grieving mother. You can't gaslight a country that's hurt enough. And you can't silence a man who finally told the truth, even if he was scared." Cruz's hands fidgeted. He reached for the talking points in front of him, but the audience wasn't listening anymore. Neither were the cameras. America had seen enough, and somewhere in homes across the country, people were texting one word to each other. Finally. The broadcast had ended, but the aftershock had only begun. Across America, screens flickered to black, but no one turned away. Jasmine's recording hadn't just stirred outrage. It cracked something open, and in the echo of that fracture, Washington was forced to act. The Senate chamber felt different that morning, sterile, colder, as though even the marble had caught wind of what had transpired the night before. Staffers whispered behind folders, reporters circled like hawks, and somewhere beneath the Capitol dome, Ted Cruz walked slower than usual, his leather shoes echoing like guilt across the tiled floors. Before the opening gavel, a private memo made its rounds through the Judiciary Committee. It bore a single subject line, typed in bold font, "Provisional Recusal Recommendation, Senator Cruz." The chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, flanked by legal counsel and visibly shaken by the public reaction, stood before cameras just after noon. Given the gravity of the allegations aired publicly and the material currently under review by the Office of Congressional Ethics, he said, "We are requesting that Senator Rafael Edward Cruz temporarily withdraw from all deliberations and votes related to ongoing immigration oversight and Justice Department inquiries." No applause, no outrage, just a stunned stillness, like a storm had just passed, but no one dared believe the air was safe. The word recusal spread like wildfire across news tickers and notifications. CNN cut from a live hurricane update to announce it. MSNBC ran a red banner that read, "Cruz faces ethics scrutiny after Crockett bombshell." On Fox, the response was defiant but uneasy. A guest host muttered, "This isn't justice. This is political theater." But even he flinched when the network cut to footage of Cruz, caught walking out of the chamber, ducking from a wall of press, his eyes shaded by defeat. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett remained quiet. She wasn't in front of cameras or holding another press conference. She was back in her office, lights off, staring at the names of victims she'd scribbled months ago in the margins of her notebook. Names no one cared about until now. A staffer approached. "They're saying Cruz might lose his seniority position. That's never happened before like this." Jasmine didn't even blink. "It's not about him," she said. "It's about what comes next." Outside, protesters gathered again. Some carried signs with Micah Rowe's face. Others held handwritten posters that read, "The system knew." Crockett spoke, "Now we see." Inside, senators argued over precedent, over whether a media appearance could really trigger an ethics crisis, over whether Jasmine had gone too far. But the nation had already made up its mind. She didn't go too far. She'd finally gone far enough. She didn't run for the cameras. She didn't cry victory. And she certainly didn't call it a win. When the headlines broke, Cruz recedes under fire, Senate Ethics Committee opens independent inquiry, Crockett forces national reckoning, Jasmine Crockett didn't post a tweet or release a statement. She didn't hold a press conference. She walked into her office the same way she had every morning for years, alone, coffee in hand, eyes steady, lips pressed in that calm before the storm look the country now knew all too well. But America was no longer seeing her the same way. Something had shifted. Outside her D.C. office, protesters gathered not in anger, but in solidarity. A wall of handmade signs lined the barricades. "Truth has a name." "Jasmine, we've got your back." Not just a moment. A movement. One woman in her 60s stood holding a faded photo of her son, a victim of wrongful arrest 20 years ago. She held it against her chest and whispered into the air, "This is the first time I've ever felt heard." On social media, her name surged past the noise. Politicians trended every day, but Jasmine Crockett didn't trend. She rose. She was no longer just a congresswoman from Texas. She was a generational fault line, splitting the old guard from the new, the whisperers from the truth-tellers, the comfortable from the called. New York Times columnist Jelani Marsh wrote, "What Crockett did wasn't just hold a line. She dared to redraw it, against a party, against a power structure, and most importantly, against silence." A student at Howard University painted a mural 2 stories high. It showed Jasmine standing beneath storm clouds, holding a gavel carved from firewood, flanked by the names of victims lost in border custody and police custody alike. At the bottom were words scrawled in graffiti paint. She asked the question no one wanted answered. What if the system isn't broken, but built this way? In Capitol Hill corridors, there was nervous laughter. The old guard hoped this would pass, that the news cycle would eat its tail, that Jasmine would be labeled radical, divisive, unfit. But none of those labels stuck, because she didn't shout them down with noise. She dismantled them with facts, with footage, with files, with a voice not polished for sound bites, but honed by survival. Young aides began quoting her in briefings. A 14-year-old girl in Arizona went viral for saying, on TikTok, "When I grow up, I don't want to be a pop star. I want to be Jasmine Crockett." Her team began receiving thousands of letters, handwritten, typed, translated, some from undocumented mothers, some from federal agents who had looked the other way, some from judges, quietly thanking her for the courage they never found inside a robe. And through it all, Jasmine stayed quiet, not silent, just intentional. Because she understood something Washington didn't. This wasn't a sprint. This was excavation. This wasn't about winning a moment. It was about unearthing a century of redacted truths, unchallenged assumptions, and doors closed with soft-spoken bureaucratic cruelty. She began receiving invitations to speak, Harvard Law, Columbia, Oxford, but she turned them down, every one of them. "I'm not done in this room yet," she told her staff. "We've torn down the wall, but I'm not leaving until I see what's behind it." And behind it, a culture of legal loopholes dressed as policy, a Senate judiciary pipeline greased with donor silence, an immigration database full of redacted abuse reports, and a power structure that, until now, thought no one had the nerve to lift the carpet and say, "There, that's where you hit it." The Congressional Black Caucus privately met and voted unanimously to elevate Jasmine to vice chair of the House Justice Oversight Subcommittee. "She's not just a truth teller," one member said. "She's a truth architect." Still, not everyone was celebrating. A Texas congressman referred to her as a one-woman wrecking ball for due process. Another said, "She's more heat than light." But their words felt tired now, like trying to cut steel with a spoon. Jasmine didn't respond to critics, but she responded to the mother who wrote her from El Paso, to the young public defender who asked how to file a FOIA request, to the grandmother who called her office and left a voicemail that simply said, "Don't stop. Please don't stop." And that's what she became. Not a viral sensation, not a headline, not a temporary scandal, but a symbol, a walking, speaking, unrelenting symbol of what happens when someone finally decides that truth isn't something you wait for. It's something you drag into the light, kicking and screaming, if you have. The chants outside the Capitol faded into nightfall, and for the first time since the whirlwind began, Jasmine Crockett allowed herself a quiet room and a single thought. If a story can shake a nation, its lesson must be strong enough to steady it. The first lesson came wrapped in discomfort. Power does not yield to polite requests. It only recoils when truth is dragged into daylight, fingerprints and all. Jasmine learned that the law's language may promise equality, yet its enforcement can still choose its favorites with ruthless precision. Cruz's downfall was not triggered by noise, but by the unignorable clarity of a recorded confession, proving that facts, not fury, bend the arc of history. In every unjust verdict and every redacted report, the system counted on silence to keep turning its gears. Jasmine's defiance broke that silence like glass and scattered its sharp edges across the Senate floor. Her courage exposed a blueprint of neglect, the unwritten orders, the discretion buffer, the spreadsheets of vanished names, and forced the country to admit that injustice is rarely an accident. It is often an algorithm disguised as order. When the public heard that recording, they finally understood that paperwork can bruise as deeply as batons, and that unchecked discretion is just violence in a tailored suit. The human message is blunt. Transparency is not a courtesy, it is a lifeline. If institutions refuse to show their seams, Citizens must be ready to pull the thread themselves. Only then does power remember who put it there. The second lesson is carved into every mother who raised a photograph of a lost child and begged the nation to look. Empathy, Jasmine discovered, is the most under-leveraged weapon in politics because it cannot be filibustered, gerrymandered, or lobbied away. When Latasha Rowe held her son's blood-soaked hoodie before Congress, she transformed statistics into flesh, and no talking point survived the tremor that followed. A just society is measured not by how calmly it reads the Constitution, but by how fiercely it protects the bodies that the Constitution forgot to defend in practice. If grief remains trapped in private living rooms, cruelty thrives. But when grief steps into public record, even marble columns can shake. Jasmine's moral calculus was simple. Policy without pain is theory, and theory without faces is fraud. The moment lawmakers were made to see Micah's hoodie under studio lights, they could no longer tuck the issue into committee recess. That visceral reminder redefined justice as an act of shared mourning, not abstract debate. The human message is stark. We either honor each other's tears or prepare to drown in them together. A nation that dares to look away from one broken family will soon awaken to a country littered with broken trust. The third lesson speaks to everyone who has ever been told to wait, to be patient, to let the process work. Patience, Jasmine realized, is often the handcuff that civility places on urgency. The proper channels are essential, but they are also the favorite hiding place of cowardice when injustice grows inconvenient. By the time Cruz invoked isolated incidents, 23 families had already buried isolated sons. Jasmine's decision to bypass closed-door committees and enter the public arena was not grandstanding, it was triage. She gambled that the country was ready for radical candor, and the flood of Crockett crushes, Cruz tweets proved her right. The system's defenders warned that open confrontation would tear the nation apart. Yet it was secrecy, not sunlight, that had let the rot spread. The human message is plain. Urgency is not the enemy of order. Secrecy is. Reform delayed is justice denied, and denial is simply injustice wearing a bureaucrat's smile. The fourth lesson belongs to those who wield microphones and cameras as mirrors of public conscience. Media platforms can amplify either courage or cowardice, and this story revealed how quickly truth can drown if responsible voices refuse to swim. Fox News portrayed Jasmine as a racial arsonist, while CNN elevated her as a truth teller, proving that narratives do not merely report reality, they recruit allegiance. Yet in the court of public opinion, raw audio outranked polished spin. The authenticity of Jim's trembling confession undercut every studio monologue. For journalists, the caution is clear. Treat every buried lead as a possible lifeline, because one unseen memo can topple a senator and rewrite the moral grammar of a generation. For viewers, the warning is sharper. Outrage is cheap. Vigilance is priceless. Democracy is not a spectator sport, and remote control skepticism will always lose to first-hand evidence. The human message: guard the gate of your attention, for the stories you let in will decide the nation you live in. An informed public can forgive many flaws, but it has no mercy for institutions caught hiding the truth. The fifth lesson is a gift to future lawmakers who think compromise is the only currency in Washington. Jasmine proved that integrity trades at a higher value than access, that sometimes the shortest path to change is a direct collision with power. She faced threats of censure, smears on cable news, and whispers of primary challenges. Yet her approval rose precisely because she absorbed those blows without flinching. In a climate addicted to incrementalism, she reminded the country that moral velocity matters, that there are moments when deferral is betrayal. Young activists now cite her approach as a blueprint. Gather irrefutable facts, wield them with surgical precision, and refuse to blink when the spotlight burns. That strategy demolished the myth that boldness is malpractice. Instead, it revealed boldness as malpractice's cure. The human message here: courage scales. One act of unflinching truth-telling licenses thousands more, creating a cascade that no firewall of tradition can withstand. Injustice counts on inertia. Bravery multiplies momentum. Finally, the story's deepest lesson is not about law or politics at all. It is about the fragility of hope and the ferocity required to keep it alive. When Jasmine stood before Congress, she carried generations of voiceless pain on her shoulders, yet she spoke with the clarity of someone who believes tomorrow can still be saved. Hope is not optimism. It is rebellion against despair. It demands that ordinary people, Latasha, Jim, the teenage girl in Arizona, step into the terrifying glare of public scrutiny and say, "This happened and you will not look away." Jasmine became the conduit of that collective courage, and in doing so, she taught a nation that justice is not a destination, but a daily decision. Each morning the sun rises on a country that must choose again, build a world where the law protects the vulnerable, or settle for one where paperwork protects the powerful. The human message is searing. Progress is not a gift delivered by heroes. It is a debt paid in relentless honesty, and each generation must contribute its share. Jasmine paid hers, loudly, unapologetically, and with receipts, and now the ledger passes to us. The question is whether we will honor it or whether we will wait for the next reckoning to remind us how high the interest climbs when truth is deferred. The lessons were etched in fire and silence, in courtrooms and living rooms, in the names of the unseen and the blood on policies signed behind closed doors. But if all we do is remember, then injustice wins again, because memory without action is just a eulogy. And Jasmine Crockett didn't risk everything for a eulogy. She fought for a movement. So now the burden shifts to us. You've seen the rot. You've heard the tape. You've watched a senator blink in the face of truth, and a mother beg the country not to bury her son twice. If you felt rage, if you felt grief, good. That means you're still awake. But don't let that feeling fade when the news cycle moves on. Channel it, use it, call your representatives. Demand public access to internal investigation reports. Show up to town halls not to take pictures, but to ask why your justice system protects power instead of people. If your senator voted to block accountability, name them. If your police department hasn't released its use of force data, demand it. If you work in the system, be the whistleblower who refuses to let another file be buried. Because Jasmine didn't stand alone to inspire applause. She stood so you would follow. You don't need a title to change a system. You need a threshold, a line you refuse to let them cross anymore. Find it, draw it, and when they try to step over it, stand like she did, with evidence in one hand and fire in the other. Speak not just for today, but for every name the system wants you to forget. Say them. Fight for them. Be loud for them. Because if we fail to act now, the next mother will hold the same hoodie, and the next Jasmine will bleed in silence. History isn't waiting. It's watching. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.